Thank you, Fernando. Ron, you wanted to add.
Sorry, in my speed to give you the 7 points, I didn't mention the names of the people on the panel. And that was Glenn Watts of the UK Environment Agency, who's still here, Rob Verheem of the Netherlands EIA Commission, and Simon Smalley from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The gentleman from the Network for Compliance and Enforcement is Ken Markowitz, who did have to leave since he just came from an overseas trip. So please stop Glenn, Rob, and Simon and ask him for any details. Thanks.
And last person down at the end of the table is goes by the name of Disaster Kelly. And Kelly chaired the session related to that. He has years of experience looking at rapid environmental assessment as it relates to disaster response. And he's got, his specialty is really beyond that. It's response to compound disasters, human responses. Been doing that for over 30 years. The session title, he heads IAI's section on disasters and impact assessment. And the title of his session was Disaster Management, Rapid Environmental Response and Climate Change. And there was a session yesterday that went all day over at USAID that he led, helped put together. And he'll tell you a little bit about that, I think, as well as the session for today. Thanks.
My email address is disasterkelly@yahoo.com. I go by Kelly. You don't have to call me Disaster Kelly. And I don't bring them, I respond to them as well. Okay, as Wes mentioned, we did have an earlier meeting yesterday co-hosted by USAID and the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, over at their building on the other side of the White House, as somebody said. You know, this is on this side, that's on the other side. So we had a whole day's discussion about issues about impact assessment, climate change, and disaster management. And I'm going to try to, and the session we had this afternoon, or this morning, I guess it was trying to summarize that session plus bring in some issues here that we thought people at this meeting would be interested in. So I'm going to try to put all these things together very briefly here. I would note that Erica Cluseri from USAID, the Bureau Environmental Officer for the DACHA, whatever they call that at AID. It's the Disaster Conflict and Democratization Group people. Anyway, there's a lot of initials at AID. Anyway, she gave a session today and talked a lot about how USAID, and particularly the area that deals with the sections that deal with disasters, food aid, and conflict, look at and how they deal with environmental issues. And if you don't know about it, USAID has a provision where they don't necessarily have to always follow NEPA. And so there's a lot of issues about how that works, how that plays out in a disaster response, at what point it should or should be applied. But also there's a lot of links to climate change and climate adaptation and climate resilience and other kinds of things that we talked about, Erica talked about from the USAID perspective, which was very useful. John Randall was the second person, or actually the third person, but the second person I want to talk about. He's from WWF, and he has a long and illustrious career. He actually has gone out and done environmental impact assessments after disasters in Mozambique, as well as in Louisiana, I think. So he brings a particular useful view to this because he's worked with WWF also on a number of projects on the tsunami recovery, where WWF decided with the American Red Cross to develop a manual on how to incorporate green issues into recovery. That will be launched, by the way, Friday morning at the Wilson Center. A little plug there. And so he talked about how WWF has been getting engaged in progressively looking at disasters, not only in terms of disaster response, but disaster risk reduction, climate change, what impacts that's having on people's lives and livelihoods and things like that. What I did to start the meeting actually was to try to summarize the meeting from yesterday. And I came up with lots of things, and I didn't cover them all. But what I'm going to do right now is just give you some snippets of things that we talked about in the meeting today, also in the meetings yesterday. So to start with, Climate change is not a disaster management problem. It's a development problem. We do disaster management. With floods, we respond. Somebody else has to take care of all the impacts of the carbon coming into the atmosphere, or whatever else is happening. So when you think that the disaster management people are going to save you from climate change, it's not going to happen. We don't have the means, we don't have the resources, it's a developmental problem. However, we're very interested in the issues of climate change because they're very similar to something else we deal with, which is called disaster risk reduction. Many of the disasters we have to respond to nationally and internationally relate to the climate: floods, windstorms, hurricanes, cyclones, tornadoes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Earthquakes, there's some argument about that, but all those others. So we're very interested in what's happening to the climate, how the rainfall patterns will change, how we'll have more storms or less storms, et cetera, et cetera. But one of my pleas, and this is a personal plea, is don't tell us stuff like storms will get worse, hurricanes will get worse. That doesn't do us any good. We want to know where, how, when, to what degree. And we also want to blend it into other issues like how many people are living there. More hurricanes in places where there are no people are not a problem for us. Okay. So from the climate change community, we need to have more precision about what's happening. And we talked a lot about this yesterday, how to take the data that we have and apply it to the community level or the national level. And there's something called FCLIM, I think if the name right, that's being developed by an AID project called FuseNet that's looking specifically at changes in climate in different parts of the world, particularly in Africa right now, to see how that has an impact on food security and therefore food insecurity, famines, droughts, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some very active work that's going on with an AID on that point. I have a question for you. Are disasters a sign of development failure or development success? And this relates to the climate. It's a strange question. But what we do know from the research that's being done is that a lot more people have moved into places that are climatologically more dangerous. They're moving into the coastal areas. Okay? They're moving into river bottoms. They're expanding occupations of areas that we know are hazardous from climatic hazards. So is that a sign of development? The factor that people can now build bigger houses on the beaches and stuff like that? Or is that a failure? And I think that's a question that both we in terms of disaster management need to answer, but also in terms of the development process, climate change adaptation have to look at. Climate change adaptation is very similar to what we call disaster risk reduction. By the way, that's DRR as opposed to DR, which is disaster response, which is opposed to CC, which is climate change, as opposed to IA, which is impact assessment. And anyway, okay, you get the idea. And what we found in our discussions was that a lot of things we do for disaster risk reduction for a flood zone is the very same thing you're going to do for climate change impact reduction. Okay, so there's actually a tremendous amount of overlap. And as a matter of fact, one person very honestly admitted that a lot of the money that we're searching for in terms of climate impact adaptation is actually going to be used for disaster risk reduction. There's a tremendous overlap between the two. So that's a good place to talk to the disaster managers because they're very interested and they know how to deal with those kinds of issues. Another point that we came up with more yesterday than today, it's kind of a funny one. We already have impact assessment overload after a disaster. Okay, the people in the field, we say, fill out this form. No, fill out this form. Fill out this form. And they stop filling out the forms and they just kind of do stuff. They've forgotten the assessment thing in general. And now we're looking at, climate. You have to now assess climate impact as part of your disaster response. It's like, well, come on, give me a break. My job is to save lives, provide plastic, give water. I'm not going to go through a whole process of assessing the climate and this and that and this. So I think we have to be clear that although we need to improve impact assessment, particularly after disasters, we need to consider vulnerability and hazards and livelihoods and all these other things. There's a limited opportunity to do those things immediately after a disaster. So we can't put more burden on the disaster response because it's just going to hamper the response itself. A very important point that was brought up yesterday by one of the people from USAID who was speaking about conflict is that climate change money can cause conflict. And we were given a couple of examples where the anticipation of money, for instance, to pay for sequestering of carbon in forests in rural Ecuador, people had already put the money in the bank, okay, basically, mentally. And if that money wasn't going to come through because of governance or some other issue, then you're going to have unhappy people, and unhappy people are one of the things that actually can result in conflict. So understanding what makes people happy and unhappy is, in a sense, very important for climate change. Everybody would agree with that. But also, you have to be careful on how you communicate and how you use the climate change money. Otherwise, you're going to end up with creating conflicts. Conflicts are a humanitarian problem, and we'll end up having to respond to those, and we'll blame you for that. Another point that was brought up, which is very similar to the no regrets, which was mentioned earlier, which is what we call do no harm. And we found, and we can document this and show you examples of disaster recovery that did harm. People were worse off after we gave them assistance after the disaster than they were before the disaster. That's not the way things are supposed to be. And to finalize, to bring it to a quote from one of the people, and to finish quickly here, good intentions do not make for good results. And I think that's a point that we've learned in the disaster management business, and you may need to start thinking about in the climate change business, because you're going to have all these great ideas about how to adjust to climate change, and you need to think through them, because a lot of them may not work out as you think. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kelly. That bureau in USAID with the strange acronym, it's Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. And the conflict part of it goes along with climate change mitigation resources, adaptation resources. The other side of this, having known Kelly for quite a while, is that he fully understands the impact assessment process and what it means to be systematic. But in a crisis situation, what he tries to do is something very quick, which then leads to a more systematic sort of recovery programmatic approach to environmental assessment. We have, I guess, about 15 minutes here. I don't know whether the session chairs want to ask each other any questions, or should we just throw it out to the floor? All right, so we'll approach this in a town meeting manner, which is I'm from the Boston area, where we're very democratic, or is it communistic? And just let folks ask us some questions. Or make, if you'd like to make a short statement, that would be fine as well, based on sessions that you were in today. I don't see a lot of movement. Well, why don't we do this? Unless, Stephen, you're afraid people will escape and run away, because this next session is the crucial one. It's where we try to put our heads together on next steps. But if you'd like to take a brief break before we do that, I think that let's go ahead. Let's do it.